There's a standard formula for success with a retro gaming channel. Pick a popular game. Put together a clickbait thumbnail. Have a rack full of recognisable vintage hardware and games to film in front of. And cover a story that is recognisable and relatable to a broad audience. I, of course, enjoy failure. So I'm going to talk about games you're almost guaranteed never to have seen, which do little of technical interest and which, in all honesty, aren't even particularly good. And I'm not even going to do that until I've given you a lot of irrelevant details about the history of the PC first. Hashtag content. The reason why I think it's unlikely you've seen these games is simple. I programmed them. It may come as little surprise to find that my day job is, more or less, being a programmer, and that it is also one of my hobbies, usually in things that have almost no relevance to real-world commercial programming in the modern age, like 16-bit segmented x86 assembler and Whatcom-C. In fact, I have been putting mysterious words of power into computers to make them do stuff since 1991, which may as well be the Victorian era as far as the average Among Us player is concerned. 1991 and that 16-bit era as a whole was a transitional stage for the idea of a home computer as something you wrote your own programs for. If you had an 8-bit micro, chances are it booted straight into a BASIC interpreter, or you were at most one menu selection or inserting a bundled cartridge away from one. Because the well-meaning intention of those early pioneers was that the home user would write simple programs to balance their finances or organise their record collection, not waste away their youth playing Jetpack. In the 32-bit era, the expectation was that if you wanted to organise your finances or balance your record collection, someone else would have written a program to do these things, and you'd go to a shop and buy it. The computer, by this point, was an appliance, and you should have about as much interest in programming it yourself as you would in writing embedded microcontroller code for your washing machine, which, now I mention it, but between these 2 points, there was a transitional state, where your computer didn't boot straight into a programming language, but you most likely had one included in your operating system if you knew where to look for it. Early Amigas came with Amiga Basic, written by Microsoft, replaced by AREX in Workbench 2 due to compatibility issues. Atari STs came with ST Basic, a rather buggy and not well-liked implementation that mainly served to create a thriving market for third-party commercial BASIC interpreters on the ST. As for the PC, well, it's a PC, so inevitably everything is complicated and really you should just give up trying to do anything with this machine and go and watch the Krypton Factor instead. But let's start with the IBM 5150 because, well, so did the PC. It came with IBM Cassette Basic in ROM, because the early PC followed typical early 1980s convention of allowing you to boot straight to a BASIC interpreter without any intermediate operating system, and save programs to tape. Cassette Basic was written, of course, by IBM's software partner Microsoft, as they moved out of their most metal software company logo ever phase into what would become their corporate behemoth phase. In fact, being a port of the existing Microsoft Basic, because at the time of the PC's conception, it was overwhelmingly the most successful and popular BASIC interpreter around, going right back to the early versions of Altair Basic in 1975. Now, if you had a disk drive in your PC, you would probably want a disk operating system with which to use it, which likely means another famous Microsoft sold, if not necessarily Microsoft created product, IBM PC DOS. If the PC detected a valid boot floppy, it would use that floppy instead of the Cassette Basic ROMs, so you would get the iconic PC experience, DOS prompt. But run basic.com from that prompt, and now you have IBM Disk Basic. Disk Basic uses code straight from the Cassette Basic ROM, and extends it by putting some routines for accessing floppy disks in RAM. This split between ROM and RAM by reusing routines from elsewhere sounds complicated, but is a pragmatic choice, when early PC configurations might only have 32K of memory, and you wanted your BASIC interpreter to use as little of it as possible, leaving more room for your own programs. Technically, the entry level for a PC was just 16K, but you'd be limited to cassette basic only, as floppy disk support required double that. And, if we're getting really strict, the smallest amount of memory IBM shipped in a 5150 with a floppy drive was 64K, but hey, it's a PC. There's nothing to stop you jamming a floppy drive and controller into a 32K machine, other than the crushing sense of futility and hopelessness at how little you'd be able to achieve with it. But we're not done yet, even for the humble 5150 with PC DOS1. Because if you did order your PC with memory to throw around as you please, there's Advanced Basic, which adds built-in sound and graphics routines, and still uses some code from the built-in ROM. So we've basically got 3 versions of BASIC, and you can use precisely none of them if you don't have a proper IBM-made 5150. No wonder Machine Gun Kelly felt moved to write a song about it. And yes, angry comments about California mental health codes is the vibe I was going for today. Thank you. Speaking of such things, I should bring up the machine which shall not be named, some kind of son of PC, a sort of not senior version, maybe even a name that brings to mind a combination of a personal computer and a Dallas character. Anyway, the PC Redacted has a cartridge port, so it gets an extended version of Advanced Basic on a cartridge. For all those Atari 800 users who missed having their BASIC interpreter, be a more tactile experience. And having mentioned IBM Cartridge Basic, we're now going to leave that whole machine well alone before I get in any more trouble. Mainly because none of these sprawling variations of IBM BASIC were relevant to me. Because I had a clone PC that wasn't an 8088-based machine and certainly didn't have any cassette BASIC ROMs. This was a problem for clone manufacturers right from the start. The PC was unusual for the time, in that it added an additional layer between operating system and hardware, the BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System, not to be confused with the basic language, as here, BASIC refers to its responsibility for doing the most simple hardware-level access tasks. This abstracted the responsibility away from the operating system, meaning you could put in different hardware and still have the same operating system work, without needing to code new low-level access routines. It also meant that to implement a PC which could run DOS, you needed to replicate the IBM BIOS, including its undocumented features and bugs. The theory that this would not be possible without making a straight-up copy of IBM's code was the subject of many legal battles, many of which IBM won with out-of-court settlements, because the clone manufacturers could not satisfactorily prove they hadn't copied implementation details for their own BIOS out of IBM's copyrighted technical manuals. That was, until companies such as Compaq and Phoenix Technologies made cleanroom implementations of the IBM BIOS, where the engineer coding the BIOS would never see IBM's technical manuals, and an audit trail would be kept of the questions they asked the people who had. Doing this was an expensive and difficult process, and companies rightfully judged that trying to do the same for the cassette BASIC ROMs would be both a pointless waste of money and also really trying their luck against IBM's legal department. So, clone PCs did not have BASIC in ROM, but as we've seen from the Sierra Online story, IBM explicitly did not stop its software partners from licensing the software they built for the PC to other manufacturers. If you've just built your clone PC and installed your legally distinct but functionally identical BIOS from Phoenix Technologies, you can then go to Microsoft and license almost exactly the same operating system as IBM PC DOS, minus a few IBM labels. Except there was an important difference. Instead of IBM's Advanced Basic, Microsoft would include an almost identical clone, with the important distinction that it didn't try to reuse code from the computer's cassette BASIC ROMs because, well, there weren't any. Instead, it loaded everything from disk into RAM, because by that point even low-end PCs came with 128K or more of memory. Although early versions of this would run using the same basic A command as IBM Advanced Basic and be branded for the particular OEM, such as 1982's Compaq Basic, from 1983, this became GW Basic. In 1986, Microsoft moved from licensing DOS to OEMs one at a time to producing the first truly generic version of DOS, MS-DOS 3.2. The first version you could walk into a shop and buy in a box that didn't also come with a whole PC in it. And here we're rapidly closing in on sometime around late 1990, on my first PC, cloned to 86 with MS-DOS 3.3 and as a consequence of that, GW Basic. Now, as anyone who's followed me for a while will know, I'm a taker-apart of things. I like to see how they work and what their limits are. So naturally, one of my first questions about this new computer, once I'd figured out how DOSPrompt worked, played a couple of simple shareware games such as Bill Pogue's Big Rig, a game I covered in my video about truck simulators, was, can I write my own programs for it? Programs of which I've kept precisely none, because you try explaining long-term backup strategies to a small child. To use, QBASIC feels very much like a classic 8-bit BASIC, with its line numbers and readily available user and call statements for diving straight into machine code. This may seem like a strange thing to say about a 16-bit program built for a 16-bit computer, but this has a lineage going back to Microsoft's earliest BASICs. Indeed, the standing view is that if you want to experience programming in a classic Microsoft line number BASIC, you may as well get a copy of QBASIC as the last and best version, not least because if you're going for the full-on original hardware experience, much easier these days to get hold of a PC that can run DOS in some form than an Altair 8800. That's not to say it without some classic 16-bit x86 quirks. There's no option to spread your code or data across multiple segments, so you get one segment for each, 64 kilobytes for code and 64 kilobytes for data. 128K is enough for anyone, as Bill Gates famously didn't say. There's a good chance he didn't even say it about 640 kilobytes, as even in 1981 it was obvious computers of the future would need increasingly large address spaces beyond what the 20-bit address bus and paragraph-aligned segments of the 8088 could provide. Microsoft actually fought to up the famous limit from its original design of 512K. Other than being an agitator for more user-accessible memory, Microsoft in the mid-1980s was well on its way from becoming a purveyor of basics and second-hand operating systems to the software juggernaut it would become by the late 90s, where they would not only provide almost all of the existing software on your PC, but also the development environment you'd use to create new software. One of the steps along this way was QuickBasic, a new BASIC which eventually became the basis of the Basic Professional Development System. QuickBasic made writing and maintaining larger programs in BASIC easier. Line numbers were no longer needed. Instead, the programmer could define labels where they needed to jump to code. But even the go-to statement itself was out of favour. QuickBasic encouraged structured programming, where code was divided into subroutines and functions which could be reused and combined together, rather than jumping between arbitrary sections of code and back again. More importantly, it broke free of QBASIC's memory limits, allowing 64K of code per subroutine, and with the use of the dynamic keyword to indicate a file pointer should be used, more than 64K of data. Although making one single array more than 64K in size required some trickery. The first versions released in 1985, although it did not gain an integrated development environment until version 2, an IDE that was to become rather important. Microsoft had a problem with DOS heading into the early 90s, one which would repeat and become very familiar later in the Windows era. MS-DOS 3.3 was widely installed, reliable, and very popular. MS-DOS 4.0 had been intended to introduce exciting new features such as multitasking, but had been scaled back to something that didn't offer much, other than support for some newer hardware, along with introducing a plethora of bugs and problems. Fundamentally, nobody wanted to upgrade from DOS XP to DOS Vista. One of the problems with early versions of DOS is the included utilities were very clunky. QBASIC was clearly based on code from the 1970s, and the only file editor was Edlin, with all the look, feel and user-friendliness of something designed to run on a teletype connected to a Unix system because, well, that was what the program it was based on did. Microsoft had a modern, good-looking and usable IDE with QuickBasic, but that was an expensive commercial product most average home users would not own. So they decided to solve all three problems at once. QuickBasic could be cut down to an entry-level product called QBASIC, with features removed, lower limits and a less well-tuned, slower interpreter, but still fundamentally the same language and IDE, giving a clear upgrade path to QuickBasic for users who wanted more power or to compile their own programs into executables. QBASIC would then be able to replace the by now antiquated GWBasic as the default programming language included with DOS. But also, by adding a special mode to the IDE where all the parts devoted to running and debugging basic programs were disabled, It could also serve as a usable and full-featured text editor. So MS-DOS 5 would come with QBasic, along with some other features such as loading system components to high and upper memory areas to free up more conventional memory. DOS 5 was popular enough to quickly become a de facto standard, and within a few months of release it was common for games to require it, either explicitly, or by requiring an amount of conventional memory which was not practical to make available, without the new HMA and UMA support. No prizes for guessing where this is going. In order to play the latest games, we had to upgrade my 286 to MS-DOS 5. Which is all irrelevant detail in terms of my adopting QBasic, because by that point, I had encountered a cut-down C compiler, called the Personal C Compiler, or PCC, on a magazine cover disc. This was a shareware version of a relatively obscure compiler, DOSCember, that was missing some tools and, at least in the version I had, most of the header files you'd expect to find in a standard C distribution. Nevertheless, C programming suited me. You didn't have to mess around remembering line numbers. Structured programming fit better with my mental model than jumping arbitrarily from one part of a program to another. Somehow I even managed to use pointers, although I had no idea what was going on beneath the concept, just that this was some series of magic incantations you needed to perform to read input and pass strings around. But how do we get from there to me writing so much as one program in QBasic, let alone enough of them to make it worth publishing a video about, even by my low standards? The answer is something else I was doing quite a lot of in the 1990s. School. British schools in the 80s and 90s had this realisation that the children they taught might find it useful later in life to be good at computers, but until the latter part of that time period, didn't have a good idea what being good at computers in a useful way would actually entail. Hence the number of people my age who got taught to make a mechanical turtle crawl across a sheet of paper with a pen in its... Don't ask what the pen in the logo turtle represents in a biological sense. No good will come of it. But in the 16-bit era, this attitude was just as much in transition as the computers themselves. So there was a settling acceptance that the thing students ought to learn in an IT lesson was how to word process a document, and create a spreadsheet, and put items in a database. But also, a lingering consideration that in between getting our funnies from automated joke machines and dealing with Android in a right old huff, the future would involve an awful lot of programming computers. Which meant that in addition to adding word art to your English homework or building a database of all your pogs, one of the officially sanctioned uses for the school computer room during break times was writing programs, in one of the two programming languages to be found on the largely Windows 3.11 and MS-DOS-based school network, Logo and QBasic. I don't want to demystify myself too much here, but given the choice between playing football in the drizzle and spending my lunchtime programming an old 486, I would choose the latter. Well, it wasn't an old 486 at the time, it was a new 486. Logo is a bit rubbish if you've not got the physical turtle to muck about with and try to crash into people's feet on the sly. So with only two languages on offer, this meant QBasic. And since the barrier to entry for the school programming club was to spend £1 on an official school-sanctioned floppy disk and turn up to the computer room in what I can only assume was a lesson about capitalism, I was not the only person to do this. Which was great for my early development as a programmer. Because if you get a group of people together who like each other, they're generally going to do two things. 1, make each other laugh, and 2, show off. I'll spare you the worst of teenage me's attempts at humour, because frankly it's bad enough having to deal with middle-aged me's attempts at humour. But the vintage showing off is definitely something I'd like to show off. But first, I need to go back to my statement that I kept precisely none of my QBasic programs, because while this is technically correct, and also was rather useful to maintain narrative flow earlier in this video, I did keep at least one instance of me converting one of said old programs to QBasic and removing the line numbers. Now see, that's technically me keeping one of my old QBasic programs, not one of my QBasic ones. Don't at me. This program is Fast Driver, and very typical of the kind of game I started out writing, text-based clones of Big Rig, except without the gameplay. There is, of course, no strategy here. You just keep choosing a direction until a randomly advanced internal counter hits 85. Maybe there's some skill in learning when to stop for fuel, although, because this is random, there's every possibility the game will drain an entire tank without generating a petrol station. Now, I think this may have been inspired by a card-based game my primary school had, although do bear in mind I'm trying to bring back memories from a time that is both very long ago and also to some extent deliberately repressed to avoid having to think about things like there not only being a song with Mr. Blobby in it, but it actually reaching number 1 in the pop charts. Oh, that initializing loading screen you may have noticed, it's only there because loading screens look, well, pro. Here is the code showing that that loading screen is just an empty loop that does nothing but keep printing block characters. Also, with an early hack I'd use a lot, playing a rest using the play music command to give consistent timing, no matter how fast the PC. Compared to most of my attempts at actual musical scores, this is far from my worst use of the play command. As time went on, I started learning how to augment my simple text-based games with graphical interludes, which were unrelated, inexplicable, and annoying in equal measure. Of course, these were simple pieces of demo code, often copied from elsewhere without understanding them, and the idea of using such graphics with update logic and a game loop attached was well beyond my early abilities as a fledgling programmer. Witness this borderline unplayable version of what could be called Space Invaders in only the most charitable of senses, which is firmly stuck in text mode. But I talked about showing off. One of the things which made the programming club more of a club than just dicking around on the school computers was that we had a small network share for sharing pieces of code, without needing to sneakernet it across the room every few minutes. And only for code we were actively sharing at the time, hence the £1 floppy disk as the price of admission, and a warning not to save programs anywhere else. I might later have got in quite a lot of trouble for finding out just how little disk space the school had by finding an exploit in the quota system and using all of it. One of my friends noticed something about this share. Not only could you open someone else's BASIC program if they saved it there, you could save a file from a BASIC program running on one machine, then open it in another BASIC program running on a different machine to share, say, a secret message. Now, I know this is kind of network file systems 101 here, but bear in mind we were 13-year-old kids in the 90s and most of us had barely seen two computers in the same place before, let alone a network of them. As soon as I discovered the secret of this, I extended it into a full chat program, with multiple rooms and user identities, Ultima Net. Obviously, the potential trademark lawsuit from Origin Systems was not a consideration here. While it might have been simplistic and also broke quite easily if two machines attempted to read the chat file at the same time, Ultima Net was successful enough to cause a problem. People turning up to Programming Club just to mess around with what amounted to disk-based IRC. Chat was swiftly banned, and the concept reiterated to us that QBASIC was for programming things, not wasting time and school resources. Of course, the idea you could make something so cool it had to be banned had exactly the effect you'd expect on a bunch of insubordinate teenagers. Everyone was constantly showing off things in the hope they would be the next so dangerous it's illegal programming trick. Code to load bitmap files, drop-down menus, whatever could be stolen from a book or elder sibling. I started to feel like I was falling behind. I had no follow-up to stealing someone else's chat code and refining it. What I needed was a book, and a book I got. This very copy, The Revolutionary Guide to QBASIC. The Revolutionary Guide contained file loaders, text scaling effects, code for playing sound through an adlib card or displaying 3D objects. But what interested me was a section in the middle of the book about building a top-down racing game I tried this early on with a game I called Oval Racer, but this was a flickery mess. And while I didn't manage to solve said flicker, I realised with smaller sprites it wouldn't matter, and created Velocity. But the real trick behind Velocity was that it used the stolen with permission Ultima Net code for a new, and in my mind certain to get banned, feature: multiplayer. A very flickery sort of multiplayer with a low update rate, and also one with a problem. Anybody could edit the code of their own version and cheat. Surprisingly to me, and not surprisingly to almost anyone else, car racing was not as fun as chat, which explains why people pay billions for social networks, and yet Motor City Online has been just Motor City and not online for quite some time. Velocity never got popular enough to be banned, although it did spawn this simple game where you attempt to splat a crude rendition of one of the more persistent offenders for editing the game to cheat at it, and also one of the few games I wrote to use VDA mode 13H, or Screen 13 in QBASIC terms, because the falling weights can be drawn without too much flickering. This lack of popularity did not stop me wanting to improve on the formula. Multiplayer might not have been the draw I thought, but my next game was going to show off what I could do, given a book on programming and a lot of free time. Velocity 2. This featured a scrolling map using page flipping to keep the update smooth, at the cost of being locked to a 16-colour screen mode. But it would not end here. One peculiarity of QBASIC's often unexpected interpreter optimization was that drawing a sprite using put was not that much slower than drawing a solid rectangle. You might see where this is going. Velocity 2 SE replaced the solid blocks with tiled sprites, and I know this looks dated and rubbish now, but at the time it was a genuine "how did you get it to do that?" Yes, by early 1998 we had far more impressive graphics at home, but we also knew how limited QBASIC was and how slow it ran. And the amusing thing for me looking at the code now is it's terrible. Poorly structured, full of repetition, with a disk access every frame, and also what few comments exist are mostly rants about people cheating and stealing code from Velocity 1. It actually surprises me looking back. There's only about a year between the simple prompt-based games and this. But I guess that's a lesson about how fast you can learn in a group, where you're all challenging each other to come up with the next greatest thing. The summer holiday of 1998 saw me determined to come back to school with something even more impressive. And I came up with this. Flying Eye, a game where you try to fly as low over a scrolling random landscape as you dare. The draw was to be those big flicker-free sprites, with animation and multiple layers, all running at a smooth-for-the-time frame rate, something none of us had managed to achieve with QBASIC before. But unfortunately, when I did return, in September, the school had upgraded the main computer room to brand new Windows 95 PCs, including restrictive management software that prevented running any DOS programs, QBASIC included. The classic programming club was over, and while I was sometimes allowed to bring in something I'd written at home to show it off, running supervised on one of the teachers' accounts, most lunchtime school computing after that point was building stupid stuff in Crocodile Clips or trying to break the management software. Besides which, at home, I had joined the internet and downloaded something far more exciting than crusty old BASIC. The C compiler DJGPP, and game development library Allegro, which ultimately led to me spending the tail end of the 90s getting hold of old 486 systems so I could mess around with Linux, and trying to build my own Penmush multi-user game. I know I had the backups for that. Fortunately for everyone, and perhaps my own tolerance for cringing at my teenage sense of humour, I don't, and so this gentle meander through DOS, BASIC and the joys of school programming club ends here for now. If you enjoyed me talking about 16-bit memory weirdness, you may also like my video about doing battle with this and more while trying and failing to reverse engineer Test Drive 3. Or, if you'd like some bonus director's commentary about how these QBASIC games actually worked, future me will be placing something right about there. Don't leave me hanging, future me.